And we will check on YouTube. We had some earlier difficulty. It wasn't feeling well.
Ah,
Almost there. All right.
oh,
Well, we're
good.
live.
All right, we good to go? All right. So, hi, my name is Lupa. I am going to be your presenter today. I first of all apologize for this. I just moved and I'm still dealing with the chaos of moving, and this was the best spot for doing my Zoom. So, thank you for your patience with the continued unboxing of my life. So yeah, I am presenting on ancestral animal and nature spirits. And this is something that I haven't really had a chance to talk to people about much, but it's become a bigger part of my work in recent years. So a little bit about me. I have been pagan of various flavors since 1996, I believe. And that path has taken me all the way from generic Wicca flavored paganism to chaos magic to neo-shamanism. And now these days, the best label for me is probably naturalist pagan. So I don't really do, I don't really do the whole supernatural thing. I don't, I tend to look at primarily scientific and personal explanations for things. But it's a path that's very deeply rooted in physical nature. So that's where a lot of my path has been the last several years. What I've been up to more recently has been, for those of you who don't know me, I used to live in Portland for about a decade, and then a few years ago I moved out to the Southwest Washington coast in the Long Beach area, and I've had the absolute privilege of getting to live and work on a growing hobby farm here that a couple of friends of mine own. So I take care of a whole slew of animals, and I take care of a beautiful nursery of native plants. And yeah, I just moved to a different building on a new part of the property. So, it's a glorious sort of chaos. By the way, if you folks have any questions, I do have the chat open. So if you want to ask any questions along the way, please feel free to pop them into that chat, and I will answer them as I get a chance to, okay? All right, so getting started with the workshop. So when we talk about ancestors, a lot of our work with ancestors tends to be with our human ancestors, and particularly our more recent human ancestors. So for example, my most immediate family background is a mixture of various European backgrounds. So English, German, Czech, French, Austrian, Alsatian, etc. So, but that's just within the last, few hundred years that I know of. I really have only traced things back a few generations. And the thing is, we as a species, if you just look at humanity, we've been around for 200,000 years. And you think about if it's 20 years per generation, that is, 10,000 generations. That's a lot of people. And then if you look prior to that, we have a lot of ancestors who weren't human. We have ancestors going all the way back to the very first animal. We have ancestors going all the way back to the beginning of life. And you can look at the direct lineage of ancestry. You can also look at the broader ecological, prehistoric ecology as, what we often think of as our greater community, our greater family. So when I speak of ancestors, I am not just speaking about, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my great-great-great-great, et cetera, et cetera. I'm thinking all the way back. And that is a much broader and deeper base of beings to draw on for help than just within immediate family. Does that make sense to you folks? Okay. So a kind of a brief history of life on Earth. And there's a couple concepts that I absolutely love because I like to talk about the concept of deep ancestry, deep ancestors. And if any of you are familiar with the concept of deep time is a way of exploring these immense amounts of time that the planet has existed. The planet is over 4.5 billion years old. That's 1,000 millions per billion. That's a long time. And sometimes it's really hard for us to conceptualize of just how big that is. So I want to go ahead and pull up real quick a really neat graphic that I use sometimes to explain to people. Let me see if I can get the share screen to work here. Here we go. Okay, so just to show you, I really love this graphic right here because it really puts into perspective how long this planet has been in existence and where we fit into that. So if you look at it as a 24-hour clock, you see here 24 hours, and at midnight is when the Earth formed 4.6 billion years ago. And just the first 3 hours, if you're to break it down to 24 hours, this first 3 hours are just the Earth getting beat up by meteorites. And that's where you get a lot of interesting metals and other elements from further out in space. And it's not for another hour that we even have the origin of life. And we don't even have the first fossils until an hour and a half after that. So that's a pretty long period of time just to get life going. Now, we often think of life as being, multicellular beings. So the beings that we can see with our naked eye. So, animals, plants, fungi, all on a multicellular level. But we didn't even get, we didn't really start getting multicellular beings until sometime after 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock, we've got single-celled algae. And then somewhere between here and the sexual reproduction is where we really started getting multi-celled beings, which would lead to us. So that's, if you go all the way to 6 o'clock in the evening, that's 3/4 of your 24-hour clock gone, already taken care of. And you look here, there's a lot that's happened in the last 3.5 hours of this 24-hour clock. We have seaweed showing up around 8:30, then we have our jellyfish, then we have our trilobites. I know I tend to think of trilobites as being way back, before the dinosaurs, before animals went onto Earth, even before plants really started making it onto the land. Plants didn't make it onto land until about 2 hours ago. And then the dinosaurs showed up just a little over an hour ago, mammals about 20 minutes ago, and humans just a minute, not even a minute and a half. So if you look at that, and if you think about that graphic, I'll put a link to it right here so you can, have that for the future. That's a really mind-blowing concept put into a good visual. It's also related to Carl Sagan's cosmic calendar, which does the same thing except putting everything into a year instead of a 24-hour clock. So I just like to open with that because it really gives people a sense of what kind of time span we're talking about here when we're talking about deep ancestors, okay? Again, if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. So why would we want to work with these deep ancestors? Why not just stick to the human ancestors that we're more familiar with and that are more, related immediately to what we're doing today? Well, part of it is the depth of knowledge that they have. The great thing about being able to draw on the wisdom and the experience of all of our ancestors and not just the human ones is because there's so much more material to work with. You know, what happens, for example, if you go back and you talk to beings that went extinct during the last 5 major extinction events? You know, we are in the 6th major extinction event, and this one is caused by humans. It's caused by our habitat destruction, it's caused by pollution, it's caused by a number of other factors that are all anthropogenic, they're human caused. And so going back and speaking to the spirits of the species that either didn't make it through ancient extinction events or that did can help give us some perspective on what to expect as we move through this particular extinction event. And for me personally, it at least gives me motivation to try and curb those effects as much as possible. I mean, I'm just one person, but you know, just by being here right now, I'm able to talk to you folks and give you these ideas and give you this inspiration. And maybe you will take that and give it to someone else. Maybe you will inspire other people to be aware of what's happening. So, you know, some of it just is that depth of knowledge and being able to speak to those beings to find their perspectives, which are a little different than the perspectives of the animals and the plants and the other living beings that are here now in this world. So that's one of the reasons. Another one is being able to connect to our own instincts and how we evolved physically and mentally, and so forth. You know, we are every bit as far from the spark, the initial spark of life as every other living being today. We are not more advanced. We are not, you know, more special. Every single species existent today has made it has a lineage that is the exact same amount of time from the first spark of life. And so when we look back at our own lineage, we can look back and see various points where we evolved certain ways of being, certain ways of looking at the world, certain ways of behavior, certain physical characteristics. And probably one of my favorite resources for that, favorite authors, is a gentleman, a doctor by the name of Neil Shubin. And he wrote a book, and there's also a TV series that PBS did a few years ago. And I'll go ahead and bring that up just so you can see it, called Your Inner Fish. And Your Inner Fish is really cool because whether you read the book or watch the series or both, it gives you this really cool look at how where certain traits of who we are now evolved way back in our lineage. And it tells us more about who we are. And then by going and talking to our ancestors who first evolved these things and first refined these traits, we can learn a little bit more about who we are. You know, we'll talk a little bit more about the triune brain in a little bit, the reptile brain, the proto-mammal brain, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a great way just to get to know more about who we are as animals, as beings. And that brings us back into the community of nature, which I'll talk more about that in a bit. The third reason, though, I want to mention, I just want to, you know, reiterate, is the fact that we are in this Anthropocene extinction event. You know, what can we learn from previous extinctions? What can we learn about beings who managed to survive those? And how do we find a sense of responsibility for what it is that we're doing, and inspiration to try and curb that effort? And I think one of the most important parts of this is the fourth reason that I think it's really important to talk to those deep ancestors, which is rejoining that nature community, retaking our place in that circle of beings, rather than seeing ourselves as separate and above. I really emphasize this idea that humanity is just another animal. Granted, we have big brains, we have opposable thumbs, we evolved upright walking, all of which had immense effects on who we are now. But we still need to eat, we still need to sleep, we still need, water, we still are affected by bacteria and viruses and other tiny beings. We are intricately interwoven with the rest of nature. And when we tell ourselves we're not a part of nature, whether it's because we think we're better than nature or because we feel guilty and we're horrible and destructive, both of those just serve to push us further away. So by setting ourselves and our species in the context of that long evolutionary trip from the spark of life to where we are now, that reminds us of where we've been. And we can speak to our ancestors along that path to remember who we are, to remember that, yes, we are just the same, again, distance from that as everything else. So we belong here. We just need to be better stewards and members of that community. Does that make sense? Okay. So those are just a few of the reasons that I like to work with the deep ancestors. So as far as finding these ancestors to work with, there are a few different methods. You might happen to already have some prehistoric spirit that you're working with. That's totally fine. I know people who specialize in working with the archetypal spirits of dinosaurs. I know people who work with the archetypal spirits of Paleolithic megafauna, so your mammoths, your mastodons, and even further back than that. I know people who, I've spent time doing guided meditations all the way back through various eras just out of curiosity to see what I can learn from those spirits there. So you may already have some favorites you work with or that you're interested in working with, and that's okay. You are welcome to go ahead and try and make that connection to see if that being is willing to be a guide for you through that period of time. Another thing I mentioned earlier, the triune brain, that's Triune. So the triune brain was, I believe, originally conceptualized in the 1950s, somewhere in the mid 20th century at least. And the idea was that we have the neo-mammalian brain, which includes the cerebral cortex, which is the most recently evolved portion of the human brain. There's the paleo-mammalian brain, which includes the limbic system, so your amygdala and your other sort of, response sorts of the brain. And then there's the reptilian brain, the basal ganglia, which is the most primitive, the part of the brain that evolved earliest, way back in early vertebrates, including the reptiles. Now, this triune brain has been, it's kind of fallen out of favor as a very strictly scientific explanation of how our brain is put together. However, it's a great metaphor for working with our brains and our spirits on a on a path level, on a path working level. So you can use, for example, the neo-mammalian brain. You can go back and see where in our lineage that first began to evolve, and you can maybe speak with the spirits of those beings who first started evolving them to find out why, how did that help them? How did it help them to have that cerebral cortex? What did it give them that their ancestors didn't have? And the same thing with the limbic system that we got from our paleo-mammalian ancestors. And before that, the reptilian ancestors with the basal ganglia. How do we, how did each section, each part of the brain benefit us? And what does that say about who we are now? You hear people sometimes talk about the monkey mind, or you talk, when your brain gets going and you're, something makes you panic. Or you talk about the reptile brain when you're talking about some very deep primal urge like anger. Why do we feel those things? So we can look at on that scientific level, but we can also look at on that spiritual level by going back and working with the spirits of those beings who first evolved it. So that's one way of accessing those spirits, is through the triune brain model. Another one is, like I said, seeking the victims and the survivors of previous mass extinction events. Now, the one we're pretty much all most familiar with is the KT extinction event, which happened 65 million years ago, when a giant asteroid hit the planet somewhere near Mexico out in the ocean. And it basically caused huge upheavals, both in the land and also in the climate. And these lasted for a very, very long time. And it was enough to take a huge number of species out of the picture entirely, including the dinosaurs, except for birds. Birds are the last lineage of dinosaurs, which I think is really cool, because I have chickens and I like to think of them as little dinosaurs. But you look back at that extinction event and you can talk to, for example, the archetypal spirit of Tyrannosaurus Rex. That species went extinct in that particular extinction event. And you can talk to them about, what was that like? What was it like watching your species fade out? But you can also go and talk to some of the early mammals that survived that extinction event. How did they survive? I mean, we know scientifically that part of what helped a lot of the species that got through by being small and not needing a lot of resources and being very versatile and adaptable. So they weren't very specialized. They were actually very rodent-like, a lot of them. And so they were able to eat a lot of different foods. They were able to colonize a number of different habitats. And I know I personally have learned a lot about adaptability just by speaking with some of the spirits of the species of early mammal that made it through that extinction event. Because I go through tough times, and maybe it's not an extinction event, but it's still something that to me is very personally challenging. So when I need that sort of inspiration to keep going through a really tough time, one of the groups of spirits I'll sometimes call on is those survivors. We deal with different sorts of challenges, but the drive is the same. So that's one example of talking with both the victims and the survivors of those extinction events. And I mainly talk about those because they're big and impressive, and it's easy to find lists of species that went extinct at that time. There have always been species dying out and others evolving into new species. So, you can talk to pretty much any ancient extinct species and get a life history of where it began and where it ended and everything in between. So, choose however you want to take that particular angle, if that's something that you want to look at. Another way that you can work with these ancestral spirits and find them, and this is one of my favorites actually, is going and talking to what's called last common ancestors. Last common ancestor. And what that means is, for example, at some point, there was a diversion. There was a last shared ancestor between us and between chimpanzees and bonobos, who are our closest living relatives. So at some point, oh gosh, I want to say maybe 10 million years ago, the last common ancestor, that species that gave birth to humans, chimpanzees, and bonobos, lived. And so for me, it's really cool to go back to that wellspring as an ancestor and find out what, for example, did we all three species carry with us from that ancestor? And why did we take some things and why did the other species take others? And you can take that all the way back. You can take it back to the last common ancestor that we had with all mammals can take it back to the last common ancestor we had with all vertebrates, et cetera, et cetera. Or if you want to go a lot closer to us, especially if you don't feel like going way, way, way back, there's this concept of a woman called mitochondrial Eve. And she is the last human being who is in every living human being's lineage, ancestry. And so if you're feeling a little intimidated by the idea of, what I call spiritual time travel, but you want to give this deep ancestry thing a try going and speak to mitochondrial Eve. She's human like us, and I've personally found that she's interested in hearing, where her, where her children and children's children and so forth have gone. So that's a good starting point for, if you don't want to go too far back, okay? And again, finally, the last way is just, and I said this before, but just pick a time. If there's a particular point in prehistory that really fascinates you, go back and explore it. Find spirits of animals or plants or other beings that lived at that time, even if they're not directly in the human lineage, even if they weren't directly behind us in that lineage, you can still go back and ask them if they're willing to be that guide for you. Does that make sense? Okay. So those are just a few of the ways that you can find those deep ancestors to work with. You might find as you start doing this work that they come to you. You might discover that there are certain beings that gravitate to you, either because they're interested in what you're doing, or maybe it's one of your ancestors, or maybe maybe they just think it's really cool that somebody's actually paying attention to them. I know when working with nature spirits that a lot of times it's the big impressive ones who get the most attention. So for example, bald eagle and various oak tree spirits, and wolf, of course, and all the big charismatic ones. And so spirits that don't get as much attention, some of them get really excited when someone actually notices them. So if nothing else, it's a really cool way to add a little bit of variety into your spiritual allies and to get a little more depth into understanding. So however you find them, or they find you, those are just a few of the ways to make that happen. And then to bring them into your practice, these are just a few ways that you can incorporate them. They may come to you with ideas and suggestions on how they want to work with you. They may say, hey, I want you to, I want to work with you on a regular basis. Maybe we'll connect on every full moon, or maybe they would like, one of my favorite things is to actually incorporate them into my ritual greetings and invocations. So when I open a circle, you go through and you greet the directions, but you can greet other beings as well, and you can invite them in. So even if I don't necessarily call them in by name, sometimes just mentioning, and I call to the deep ancestors and I invite you to be with me tonight. That is a way that you can honor them and incorporate them, and that gives them space in your circle so that if they have something they want to contribute, it's easier for them to do so. And it lets them know that you appreciate that they're a part of your path. Even if you're not in ritual, if you have the space, there's always the option of shrines and altars, and having just a little space in your home that's just theirs. They don't, the thing with any of you who are big fans of creating various shrines and altars around your home, how they can just grow very quickly. And that's fine. If you find some really cool statue, it reminds you of a spirit that you work with, and you want to buy it and take it home, awesome. Yeah. So yeah, that's a really great way to sort of have that little touchstone, that little place. It's like having, we have pictures of our human ancestors in our home. A lot of us happen to have photos of parents or grandparents or even great grandparents framed and sitting on the wall or on a shelf or in a photo album. And that's a little touchstone to connect with them, even if they're no longer in this world. Well, you can do the exact same thing with your deep ancestors. Now, some of them, they're easier to find depictions than others. I mean, you can find a Tyrannosaurus something almost everywhere. You can find t-shirts, you can find statues, you can find old movie memorabilia from the Jurassic Park movies. All of those potentially work as a way to honor Tyrannosaurus Rex if you choose to have her in your life, and if she wants to have a place in your home. But some beings, it might be a little more difficult to find a depiction. There are, there are a few, you can find occasional bits of art of things like trilobites and so forth. But what if the being that you're working with is something a little less charismatic? Maybe all it has is a Latin name. Maybe we haven't given it a common name. Maybe it wants you to give it a common name that you work with rather than the Latin name. But if there's no images of it, that's okay. You can, if you're an artist, even if you're not, the greatest artist in the world, you can try drawing or painting a picture of that being based on whatever we think we know about it, whether that's from fossils or artistic recreations, etc. If you want to commission another artist to do it, great, that's another option. You can write a story or a poem or a song and put that on a shrine or altar. You can even put something that reminds you of that being. One of the focuses for my deep ancestor altar is a big chunk of shale that has a bunch of impressions of fossilized ferns on it from the Carboniferous era. And that is basically emblematic, not just of the ferns themselves, but of the beings that lived in that forest at the time. So even if I don't know their names, even if I don't know what they look like, that is still a focus that I use to connect with them when I want to work with them. So as with any shrine or altar, do what you will with it. Now, those are just a couple of sort of passive ways to incorporate them into your path. You're just sort of wrapping them into what you're doing day by day. But you can also, just like any other spiritual ally, you can ask them for help. If you happen to be working on a particular spell and there's a particular deep ancestor spirit that you think might be able to help you with it, you could go to them and say, hey, are you willing to add your energy or your blessing to the spell that's working I'm doing? If there's a problem in your life that you're dealing with and you don't know quite how to fix it, and you think they might have a little insight, even if it's not exactly the same kind of thing they've dealt with, talk to them, see what they might have to say. You might be surprised. Again, the thing about the spirits of species that haven't been on this planet in a while is they have a different way of looking at the world than we do. And in some ways that can be a bit of a hindrance because maybe they don't get the context of things like, well, my car broke down, so I can't get to work and I'm worried I'm going to lose my job. But they definitely understand the concept of I'm not able to go where I need to get the resources that I need to survive. And so you can ask them, well, what did you do when you got into the situation? And maybe their answer needs to be translated into the 21st century, and that's okay. But it's something to think about. So you can ask them for that help. On the other end of things, it's really important to ask what you can do in return. One of the things I see all too often with spirit work is people take, gimme, help. And then they don't offer to give much back. Maybe they'll give a token here or there. Maybe they give the thing you're supposed to give, like, this tradition says that I leave out bread and water, overnight on my altar. Well, that's not very personalized. If one of your ancestors, human or otherwise, has done something to help you, you can ask them what they would like in return. And when in doubt, one of the things that I found that goes over pretty well with just about any deep ancestor, who's gone extinct, is working to preserve life in this moment, working to undo the destruction that we've done. So my favorite way of doing that is going out and doing volunteering uh, in habitat restoration. So I've done everything from invasive species removal to native planting. Litter pickup is a big deal. Even if you don't have a park or a reserve or a refuge near you, just going out and picking up trash can be huge, because garbage, not only is it unsightly and polluting, but unfortunately animals sometimes mistake it for food and they eat it, and that makes them sick, and sometimes they die. And it can make it harder for certain plants to grow and so forth. So just going out and making the land a little bit better can be a really great way to say thank you to those ancestors. They suffered through all kinds of things in their lives over millions and millions of years to get us and other beings here where we are right now. We carry those genes with us that they gave us. And one of the best things we can do is make sure that those genes continue in whatever form they happen to be in. And so by creating a good world for all living beings, we increase that possibility that those gifts will continue on into the future. And if you're not able to volunteer, maybe you're not physically able, or maybe you don't have the time, that's totally, totally okay. If you have a little bit of extra money, even if it's just a few dollars, try donating it to a nonprofit organization that does that sort of work. My favorite one is the Nature Conservancy. But there's also, there's a lot of other organizations working to, do conservation and environmental work. A lot of them are local to you. So you might look and see if anybody's working to protect your local watershed, or your local river. A lot of national wildlife refuges and national parks have friends organizations that are basically sort of nonprofit branches that help support those entities. And just look around and see who is doing the good work. It's like Mr. Rogers said, look for the helpers. Who are the helpers, and how can you help them? And how can you be a helper? So always ask what you can give in return. Don't just take. And I think honestly, the best in that vein, kind of the last thing I want to mention in that is live the best life you possibly can. I am the product of 4.6 billion years of the earth existing, and 3 billion and change years of life existing. And I feel that in order to, this is, as far as I'm concerned, this is the only life that I am absolutely guaranteed to have. I know that I have this life right here, right now. I'm experiencing it. And so if this is the only one that I ever get, let's say that there's no reincarnation and this is all that I get, I figure that I owe it to the beings who helped me to get this amazing, literally once in a lifetime experience by doing the most that I can with it. Now, that doesn't mean work myself to death, but it does mean get as much enjoyment and engagement and connection as I can while I'm here. There's a lot of awful things going in the world right now. 2020 has just been terrible on a whole bunch of different levels. I'm not going to get into that because we all know about it already. But there's also a lot of really amazing things out there too. I am so lucky that I can walk outside and I can see a whole variety of evergreen trees and native plants and wildlife. And I can look up in the sky when it's not full of smoke, and I can see beautiful clouds, and at night I can see stars and things like that. And even when I lived in Portland, you know, I was surrounded by living beings, and I could go down to the rivers and see where the rivers had carved out their beds over thousands of years. And I could appreciate the contours of the land that I could see all around me. And for me, I think one of the best ways to say thank you to our ancestors, no matter who they are, is to make the most of this life and to do the best with it that I possibly can. So that is a very brief introduction to working with deep ancestors. We could get in a lot more detail by going down each one of those rabbit holes, but this is just a very quick intro. So do you folks have any questions? If you have any questions, you can open up the chat. If you go down on the bottom of your screen and hover your mouse over, it should be a little thing. It says chat, and you can type it in there. And if you happen to not, you know, if you think of something later, I'm going to go ahead and put my email address in the chat. Oops, it'd help if I typed it correctly. You are always, always, always welcome to email me. And if you didn't see that, it's lupa.greenwolf@gmail.com. lupa.greenwolf@gmail.com. You can always email me, ask me questions. If you happen to do some deep ancestor work and you need somebody to bounce ideas off of, let me know. And yeah, the other thing I just want to mention real quick is I am self-employed, and I am an author as well as an artist. I make art out of hides and bones and other natural materials, a lot of which are secondhand or otherwise reclaimed. And I've written several books on, oh, thank you. I've written several books on nature-based paganism. Some of them are still packed up, but I have a few of them here. New Paths to Animal Spirits is one of them, and that's a really good intro if you've never worked with animal spirits before. This is probably my favorite get you started book. There's also, I created a tarot deck and book, the Tarot of Bones. There's a book that goes with it. You don't need the book. I put the basic meanings on the website for free, thetarotofbones.com. And speaking of dead things, there's also Vulture Culture 101, which is my most recent book, which is basically just about, you know, the subculture around, you know, hides and bones and other natural history specimens. But if you do want to check out my other books, like I said, I have lots more than that. A good starting point is thegreenwolf.com, not greenwolf.com, the Green Wolf. So I'll put that into the chat as well. So yeah, that's a great place to get started for all things Lupa. There's also a contact form there. So if you need to get in touch with me, you can get in touch with me that way. Again, I love email. I love questions. And I love hearing about what people are doing spiritually, if you do something cool with what I'm working with. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. It's really fun getting a chance to talk about all this. It's a nice break from you know, moving. We got a good question in the chat real quick. So the question is, so language isn't a problem in working with them. So the thing that I have personally found is when I talk to the deep ancestors, I feel I hear it as words, but it more translates into energy and feeling, if that makes sense. So yeah, you know, your average triceratops is not going to understand English, but by the connection that we have energetically during that meditation or during that ritual, that translates back and forth, if that makes sense. Now, the further back you go, the more time it may take to connect with those spirits and get them comfortable with you. But that's why it takes some patience. But yeah, language doesn't really seem to be a barrier any more than it really is with working with, you know, our human ancestors. So that's the short version. Any other questions before we go wandering off into the rest of our day? All right, well, again, like I said, if you want to get in touch with me, if you have questions, we had a question, nature spirits. What about the nature spirits? So nature spirits, just to talk about that for a second. When I talk about nature spirits, I'm talking about personally archetypal nature spirits. So I'm not just talking about an individual. Oh, so in the book, New Paths to, the part of the title of the book of the workshop. So I'm sorry, it's been a very long day. So part of the title of the workshop, when I refer to nature spirits, it's what I've been talking about during this time about the various animal and plant and fungi and other spirits of living beings. So I personally tend to work, as I said, with the archetypal beings, what some people think of as totems, although I don't like using that word because it's very culturally specific. But when I'm talking about the archetypal spirits, it's sort of the overarching sort of guardian of that species. So when I talk, for example, about, gray wolf, I'm not just talking about an individual wolf spirit. I'm talking about sort of the overarching archetypal gray wolf, everything from the behavior and natural history of gray wolves to the stories that we have talked about that have wolves in them to our relationships with these animals. All of that is worked in together into this one archetypal being that represents that species. So those are the nature spirits I'm talking about, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Awesome. All right, any last questions before we finish up? Oh, and there's some interesting, good stuff in the chat as well. There's a schedule. Oh, good. Interesting on voting.
Full schedule for tomorrow. Oh,
yes. Oh, good. And
go ahead.
oh, I was going to say, book. Can you be more specific, please, Julie? Oh, yeah. There are a few of them. Just again, New Paths to Animal Spirits was one of the books that I mentioned. Let me put up a link real quick to the book's page so you can look at all of them. There you go. Oh, nope, that's a typo. Ignore that one. Okay, there we go. thegreenwolf.com/books. That will take you to all the books and has more information on them. It has tables of contents, et cetera, et cetera. There's ordering information. If you have any issues ordering, just email me. And yeah, we'll go from there. And if you buy a book directly from me, it comes with a free signature. So yay, signed books, in case that's something that's, makes it extra special. And yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Like I said, again, this was a great break from all the work I've been doing, a chance to settle down and remind myself of, some of the fun things in my life. And yeah, I hope you all have a lovely weekend and enjoy the rest of Puget Sound Pagan Pride Day. Did I get that right?
You did. Thank you
Yay!
so much.
That's a lot of words.
The end of the last presentation for today. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody online in a few minutes. But again, thank you so much, Lupa. The schedule for tomorrow is in there. We've got another 20 amazing speakers and crafts, as well as a link for voting. Please, all pagans, vote. Get out, get registered, make your intentions known. Thank you all. Blessed be.
Yay.